another Monday. My head is a little bit sore because it was St. Patrick's Day yesterday. We are the Religious Studies Project. I'm Chris Cotter, and I am joined from across the other side of, well, the city, in
Yes.
whatever the other side is, I don't know, by my host.
It's David Robertson, of course. And this explains why you had to be at another meeting at 11:15 yesterday morning. I hadn't realised it was St. Paddy's. Oh, it's not. No, I'm getting my time streams mixed.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was...
We're in the future.
That was the actual date, not the date of broadcast. I'm going to stop talking, and Chris is going to introduce the episode.
Yeah, so it's a second podcast from our new interviewer, Chris Black, and she's been speaking with Nancy Ross about Mormon Garments and Agency, although we're not supposed to say Mormon anymore, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. So take it away, Chris and Nancy.
The form of garments has changed over time, from wrist to ankle, single piece, long underwear, to versions that included short sleeves and legs, to the two-piece styles that are common today. One of the most difficult aspects of studying garments is that talking about them is a transgressive act. Today, join us as we talk about garments. I'm here with Dr. Nancy Ross, assistant professor at Dixie State University in St. George, Utah. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
So let's talk about garments.
I should first probably begin by explaining what garments are. Sometimes they're referred to as Mormon magic underwear by popular media. And that's a bit of a tricky thing. Mormons hate that. That's like super offensive. But they are religious underwear that committed Mormons wear night and day for their whole lives.
What do you mean by committed Mormons?
So you can go to church if you're on a Sunday, if you're a Mormon, and they recently shortened it to 2 hours. The whole world, Mormon
used to be 3.
Right. The whole world, Mormon world is celebrating. But in addition to Sunday worship, there are also opportunities for further worship or deeper commitment. Mm-hmm. And those happen in LDS Temples. So the full name of people talk about the Mormon Church, they're typically talking about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, mm-hmm. or I'm going to use the shorthand LDS Church.
Okay.
And there are a number of LDS temples throughout the world. They're generally very fancy-looking buildings, and only committed Mormons can go inside them. And inside, they make kind of further and deeper commitments to their faith and to God through a number of different ceremonies, typically through the initiatory ceremony and the endowment ceremony. And in the initiatory ceremony, Mormons receive garments, and that's kind of the starting point for wearing them for the rest of their lives.
Okay, and what age do they become committed Mormons?
So typically Mormons we talk about it as going through the temple for the first time. Mm-hmm. And that often happens just prior to young adult Mormons going on a mission, typically at maybe age 18 or 19, or it happening just prior to marriage.
Okay. For both men and women?
For both men and women, yes.
Okay. And so not every Mormon would be committed in this sense, is that right?
Correct. Many adult Mormons are, but not everybody does this in quite the same way. I have some adult Mormon women friends in their late 30s and 40s who have chosen never to make this deeper commitment. I think that there are aspects about the commitment that make them feel uncomfortable.
Right. So talk about that a little bit, about why it's such a transgression to talk about garments.
So everything that is associated with the temple is, Mormons would say it's sacred, not secret, but it's also secret.
Also pretty secret.
It's also pretty secret. And so the idea is that something is so sacred that you aren't supposed to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And so Mormon temple ceremonies definitely fall under that category. You are supposed to experience them with your bodies, but you don't necessarily discuss in great detail their meaning. Mm-hmm. Even in Mormon circles, I certainly never have been, or haven't often been, part of discussions with highly committed Mormons about the meaning of temple ceremonies, but it's something you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And then garments become the evidence or the daily reminder that you have made that deeper commitment to the LDS Church.
Okay. And in your work, you talk, it's a qualitative study, and you did a questionnaire.
Yes.
And you really, it seemed like you were pushing on the idea of identity.
Yeah. So I have a co-author on this particular study. Her name is Jessica Finnigan. And what happened is that at the time we decided to do this study, Jessica and I were both committed Mormons at that time, but struggling with the practice of wearing garments. We were both involved in Mormon feminist circles. Yes, it's a thing. And garments often came up as a topic of discussion, right? This taboo topic often came up as a topic of discussion within Mormon feminist circles, which are prone to talking about the things you were not supposed to talk about. We felt that in order to understand our experiences and our frustrations better, that we wanted to study the problem. And so we decided that it would be difficult to recruit interview participants to be interviewed about garments, because that seems very awkward and kind of inappropriate, particularly in a Mormon context. But that rather we would send out a survey, and that people could participate in the survey anonymously and tell us what their garments meant to them. We collected a lot of demographic data. We asked people about their Mormon belief, if they agreed or disagreed with particular statements. We asked them a lot of questions about garments and how they felt about their bodies. What did it feel like to wear garments? What did their garments mean to them? And how they engaged in the practice of wearing garments. This just wasn't a very open conversation at that time beyond my Mormon feminist circles. And I just really needed to know. I was really struggling with issues of faith and the practice of wearing garments. And we just needed to, I just needed to understand if it was just me.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned in your work this word friction.
Yeah.
And it sounds like there was a spiritual friction for you.
Yes.
And you also mention it as a physical experience for many women, especially wearing. Talk a little bit about that.
So in the sociology of religion, there are a number of frameworks that we often use to describe particularly women's experiences in gender traditional religions. Agency is a very common one. I have used agency, but also embodiment. Embodiment is also something that's discussed quite a lot in scholarship of religion circles these days. And I'm still relatively new to embodiment. Agency is something I've used more. But as I understand kind of the framework of embodiment or the theory of embodiment, it's the idea that our bodies can produce religious knowledge or like knowledge about religion. And so through the kind of life cycle and our practice of religion.
So you were talking like a Geertz type of experience here?
Little bit.
Geertz type?
Little bit. Yeah. But that, and really also just, I think the way that our bodies interact with, even going back like Judith Butler, like,
I see.
Our bodies perform religion and our performances aren't necessarily conscious and like super intentional. It's just like the stuff of life,
right?
And the stuff we do unconsciously. And for Mormons who come to our garments, it's just like what you do. It's your underwear. It's what you do. You just put them on.
Okay.
And so over time, this particular practice was difficult. Initially, when I first went through the temple and received garments, it was prior to my being married. I was 23. I was a grad student, and I knew that, right, like this, that there's a certain weirdness about the practice, but I was framing it in my mind like, this is what it means to be an adult in my community. And at 23 and being unmarried, I hadn't really felt like a full adult in my community. Does that make sense? And I felt like by going through the temple in preparation for marriage, by receiving and then wearing garments daily, that I was, becoming a fully fledged and recognized adult in my community, by making this deeper commitment and then by wearing the garment daily, day and night, to kind of represent that commitment. And I was okay with that. That wasn't something that initially bothered me. There were like, I don't know, discomforts. I always felt like my garments were trying to climb out of my neck hole for my shirts. And I always felt like that. But initially it was just fine. It's like, this is what it means to be an adult in my community. this is its own kind of coming of age sort of ritual.
Mm-hmm.
This is what this means. And I was okay with that for a really long time. But then when I became pregnant with my first child, my body changed shape in very dramatic ways. I am a short person. And so my body became very round very quickly. And the garments that I had did not easily accommodate or created additional discomforts for my body. And so there are pregnancy and maternity garments. There are nursing garments that are supposed to help facilitate changes in the shape of women's bodies. But many Mormon women acknowledge that maternity garments and nursing garments do not do this very well. They are not very accommodating of the change in women's bodies. And so I go through this change. I have an emergency cesarean and I'm in the hospital for a while and I'm trying to figure out how to manage, the waistband of my garment bottoms with my cesarean scar, right? And just the stuff of life, right? And the stuff of, many women's lifespans. And then after my first pregnancy, through the process of nursing and then quickly getting pregnant with the second child and going through, more dramatic changes in body, and then having at the end of that 2 very tiny children and not handling that especially well and feeling kind of depressed, but also feeling like I've been through this big life thing and my body has changed. And this practice that was once okay, and it was fine.
The practice of wearing garments.
It was fine. I understood it in a particular cerebral way, and that largely worked. It was okay. Then it became less okay. It became trickier. I don't know if this falls into the category of too much information, so you can just let me know. But some Mormons feel like you have to wear the garment underneath your bra.
Right.
And that can make nursing an infant very difficult, right? Because if you're trying to get access to your breasts to feed your child, and you're suddenly having to sort out not 1 or 2 layers of clothing, but
several,
a whole raft of layers of clothing, that quickly gets cumbersome, and if you spend your life breastfeeding, which you do if you breastfeed an infant, that's a lot of difficulty and a lot of wrestling with your clothing. Eventually I changed my practice so that I was wearing garments under, but that felt a little bit scandalous.
It's still, yeah.
To me, and other women would say that was fine, but that was not necessarily presented to me as being fine because I had understood that I had to wear the garments against my skin only. And so anyway, lots of information about Nancy's garments. But yeah, so this practice that was initially fine, and I understood in a particular context, and it made sense to me. It's just that as my body changed, and as my need to interact with my body changed, particularly through the practice of nursing and just growing into a very different shape, suddenly that did not work well. And suddenly things like waistbands became very uncomfortable and just too much fabric and endless tucking. I was just always trying to retuck in my underwear. And that became very frustrating. That's part of my embodied experience of my garments, where initially it was okay, and I felt like this was in harmony with my religious beliefs. Yes, it was fine for, God to require this of me, as I believed at the time. But then garments represent the LDS Temples, and they represent covenants that Mormons make in LDS Temples, covenants of commitment to God and church. And so they're like an extension of the LDS Temples. They're an extension of a particular kind of belief in God and commitment to God. And so as that symbol became more and more difficult to manage in my life, literally there was more friction with my body. I was still post-pregnancy, I was still trying to figure out what this new shape of my stretched out body was like. And my new kind of stretched out and nursing body did not accommodate garments very well, like my pre-pregnancy and nursing body had. And so this daily, everyday practice suddenly became very difficult. At the same time, I had committed to wearing these day and night for the rest of my life. And I felt very committed to my religious belief. And I didn't feel like I could really do anything. I felt a little bit trapped in this particular practice. And so that's when, I meet Jessica, we start writing papers about Mormon feminism, and, we're complaining about our garments. I'm like, but let's study this. Let's figure out if other women are experiencing the things that we are experiencing. And we figure that survey is the best way for us to do this. So we, go through an IRB process and, write this survey. And when we put this survey out online, we used a snowball sampling method. We realized has some problems. If you're trying to create a representative sample, we determined that this would not be a representative sample, but would give us some data about people's experiences and how they felt. We actually got more than 4,500 responses. Not a small number. Yeah, not a small number. And it's more data that you can analyze easily, that's for sure.
Right.
And it turned out that a lot of people had very different experiences with their garments. And in a sense, it was comforting to find out that there were many women who had far worse experiences with their garments than Jessica and I had had.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
But also, there seemed to be people that had problems and seemed to be people that didn't have problems. And there seemed to be people who were just fine with the practice and that was working for them very well in their lives. And where there was no friction with body and belief. And there were other people like me who were really struggling. There were people who had stopped wearing their garments. Garments had become, one reason or another, such a really big issue. One thing we kind of saw in the data, garments largely look like men's underwear. So if you think of men's underwear as like a t-shirt and, some boxer shorts, garments are white versions of those with some special sacred LDS temple markings. And
so they're not the full body coverage.
No, they're not the full body covering. Okay. Yeah, that wouldn't work in my desert location. And for women, it's like a cap sleeve shirt.
Okay.
With shorts.
Knee-length shorts?
Yeah, knee-length shorts.
Okay.
And what we found is that, for many men, their garments look like the kind of underwear that they would wear, even if they weren't Mormons and hadn't been through the temple.
Nothing foreign to them.
Right. Markings and the requirement.
Right, but not
fundamentally different. But for women, there were very different issues because women's bodies change through the lifespan in ways that men's bodies do not change. And women's garments don't look like women's underwear. If I were to identify, regular, standard, secular women's underwear as like a camisole and panties, this was a lot more fabric and a lot more covering.
Right.
Women's garments, until fairly recently, were edged with very itchy lace all over. That's also very visible because it creates a very distinct raised line that is visible through outer layers of clothing. So our data really gets us into what people's garments mean to them, and also how are garments functioning in Mormon community? What do garments mean? What are people's experiences with their garments? How do the garments make them feel? How do garments impact sexual relationships and marriage relationships? And, we just asked a whole raft of questions. And then we were hugely surprised when people seemed really eager to answer these questions. Because it seemed like this might be too taboo.
Right.
But when we asked the questions, an overwhelming number of people were willing to answer. And so we were able to get a lot of really great data, which was pretty exciting.
Yeah.
From a research point of view.
Right. So it kind of sounds like, and I know that people will be putting these pieces together themselves already,
sure.
is that in a patriarchal society,
Yeah.
designed by men,
Yeah.
that really police women's bodies in every way already, it's not a big surprise that they would be designing underwear for them without their bodies, without especially their sexualized bodies in mind. So is that something that a lot of the respondents talked about directly, or is that just kind of an implied thing that you can kind of infer?
No, a lot of respondents talked about body issues very directly. The data is just like Datapalooza, and we're still trying to pick out all of the most meaningful elements of this data. But this is, one thing is clear so very loosely, about half of women experience their garments as interfering with their sexual relationships with their spouses. It's really divided half and half. Half of Mormon women that we surveyed, again, it's not generalizable, right. that we surveyed, feel that it does impact their sexual relationships, and half feel that it doesn't. And so that was a pretty tidy divide. Many men reported that, not that they felt that their own garments were unattractive necessarily, but they reported that their wives wearing garments was kind of put them off sex, that they were unattractive, and that created a problem in their intimate relationships. And so that was really interesting that, men weren't really concerned about how they looked in their garments, but they were very concerned about how their wives looked in their garments. We didn't really get women saying that they were concerned about the way that their husbands looked in their garments, but we got a lot of women saying that garments impact the relationship they have with their bodies. So for some of these, that was in terms of feeling sexy and attractive. For some women, that was a literal deadening of the senses. So some women felt that garments deadened their senses and kind of prevented them from being able to feel. Some women felt that the ugliness or unattractiveness they felt in their garments had impacted their life in other ways. Some connected eating disorders with wearing garments. Oh, wow. Right. And so it's not just about sex and sexiness. It's about women's relationships with their bodies. And garments were definitely impacting women's relationships with their bodies in a variety of ways, where men's bodies didn't seem to be impacted in the same way. It's not to say that men's bodies are not impacted by garments. Right. But largely they seem to be impacted differently. And so, and it's not just these different mental, emotional perception issues. Women also had, hundreds of women reported medical conditions that were caused or exacerbated by wearing garments. So the making of garments is controlled. I can't just, learn to sew one day and whip myself up, garments in a fabric or, in a cut that, suits me exactly.
And you're not supposed to modify them either.
No, you're not supposed to modify them. Right. You're supposed to wear them as you receive them. And, you go to, Beehive Clothing and buy them. So there's a particular distributor. You have to go to a particular place. And there is a little bit of choice in fabric and cut, but not very much. And so what women experience then is that hundreds of women experience yeast infections, which are triggered by garments, urinary tract infections, which are triggered by garments, problems with managing menstruation. Well, when the latest version, the two-piece version of women's garments were created, I think women largely wore sanitary pads and belts. Right. And that is not a thing I remember. I think my mom had one. I think it was in a bathroom drawer somewhere. Yeah. But so the form of underwear didn't really matter because managing menstruation seemed to be different. Right. It happened differently. But today, it's very common to sanitary products with wings, right? Right. And garments don't accommodate many contemporary menstrual products very well. Right. And so that creates a kind of messiness and a problem in addition to pregnancy and nursing. So, and other women reported additional autoimmune disorders or various disorders that were impacted by the wearing of garments. Some women overheated very quickly as a result of wearing, because again, this isn't you don't wear a camisole if you don't want to wear a camisole. You have to wear the additional layer on top. I live in the desert. Wearing garments in the desert was very difficult.
It's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing that friction is happening then on another level. I think we need to kind of reinforce this idea, or maybe remind listeners that there's this idea of gender being eternal within Mormonism. Mm-hmm. So it's really a physical body embodied religion in that sense. So when you're having this problem with a gendered body wearing religious symbols, and both are supposed to be eternal, am I reading that right? That's how this friction, spiritual friction, comes into play?
Right. So the physical issues can become sources of spiritual friction. Because if God is somehow, God and your promises to God and your relationship to God are somehow embedded or represented in the garment, then like physical friction with the garment, or medical problems, or difficulty with menstruation or pregnancy or nursing or whatever that is, all those problems can then create a feeling of disconnection with God. Right. So if you are beginning to resent the garment and having to wear the garment and having committed to wearing the garment, then what can sneak in there is a feeling like, I don't like that God has required me to do this. I'm feeling resentful towards God or my faith or my church, for this to have happened. And so those symbols then are not positive reinforcements of commitment and identity, but rather they can transform into something negative. And then there's a real disconnect between people who are like, no, garments is a beautiful practice. I feel connected to God which is what many people said. I feel connected to God. I feel reminded of the temple, and the temple is this very special and sacred place. And that's a beautiful thing in my life. And so garments are a beautiful thing in my life, and I don't have physical problems wearing them. A real disconnect between, Mormons who feel that way about the garment, and then Mormons who are like, this is a disaster, and it's not only a disaster for me physically, it has really begun to impact my faith. Because through the difficulty of wearing the garment, we've introduced faith difficulties as well. Like the physical friction becomes the religious or spiritual or faith friction.
And a cultural friction.
Yeah. Because if you take them off, yes, it's your underwear, and you want to say, well, who's looking at underwear? But
well, a lot of people.
But in Mormon communities, these garment lines are very visible and expected. Right. And so it's an easy way to check. If I were to be in a church setting, and I were to notice that, in the woman sitting next to me, that she didn't have the same garment line as everyone else, I would know that there was something wrong there. Maybe she had broken her covenant to continue to wear the garment, or that she had done something in her life that had led the bishop to tell her that she had to stop wearing garments, because a garment is a symbol of like the in-group of Mormonism, the inner group of very committed individuals.
And Mormons use the word worthiness.
Yes.
So when you said something was wrong there, maybe that would be what would come to mind, is that she's not as worthy.
Right. Mormons meet with their bishop for what we call temple recommend interviews, to gain access to the temple, which is, a special and sacred thing. But they have to be living the tenets of Mormonism in order to be able to do that. And to verify that they are doing that, they have to have what we call a temple recommend interview. And one of the questions in the temple recommend interview is about whether or not you're wearing garments night and day as instructed and covenanted in the temple. And so you can't then continue to participate in the inner group of Mormonism if you're not wearing your garments. And so garments are connected, and there are other things that happens in temples, like you may not, if you're not wearing your garments, you may not be able to go to your child's temple wedding or a friend or other family member's temple wedding. And that can create real isolation. To be wearing your garments is to be more included in Mormonism.
So it's not just a hierarchy in the culture. It's also a hierarchy in the religion itself, and it's tied to your salvation in a way.
Right, because temples are spaces that reflect and represent the eternities and to a certain degree the afterlife in Mormonism. And wearing garments connects people to that sense of salvation in the afterlife. And so not wearing your garments is, I think for many Mormons, putting themselves in a spiritual jeopardy. and as well as a community jeopardy or potential loss of community status. And so there is so much pressure in Mormon communities for people to wear garments, even though clearly, as our survey shows, there are many Mormons who struggle with this practice.
Right. So not having that visible line, that visible emblem of belief carries a lot of baggage with it.
Yes.
So in your presentation, you talked a little bit about the circular thing of going to the temple and being tied to family and the garments, and it was kind of self-reflective. Can you just kind of mention that again?
Sure. Which is that, so Mormons believe that families can be together forever, and it is the temple ceremonies that people go through that bind them, or Mormons use the term sealing. Families are sealed together forever, and then garments are part of that reminding and part of that ongoing assurance of salvation. And then to stop wearing that practice is to put that in jeopardy.
What is put at jeopardy? So it's not just being able to go to the temple that's at jeopardy. It's
right.
this unseen layer of
And so many
connection.
Mormons feel that maybe if they don't wear their garments, or if they stop wearing their garments, that maybe they won't be with their family in heaven after they die. And that is a big weight.
Yeah.
Right. That is a big weight of expectation.
Yeah.
Where many people clearly expressed a loss of agency. They felt like they then couldn't make a choice to either create an adaptation for themselves that worked. Maybe that would be to wear them sometimes, but not other times. But there was a real resistance to feeling empowered to adapt a practice of garments that would suit their own needs, but rather feeling compelled to wear their garments in the way that the community expected them to, and that was necessary for salvation in the Mormon context.
Right. So the sense of identity is an identity within yourself, identity within your community, and identity of how you relate to God.
Yeah.
In the eternities. That's pretty huge.
It's pretty huge.
It's hard to comprehend, really.
Right. And you have to do it every day.
Yeah.
Right. And it's something that connects. But then, in many ways, that's part of the beauty of garments, right? That you're connected to salvation through your underwear, right? Through the everyday.
So everyday, yeah.
So ordinary.
Yeah.
And I think that for good reason, many Mormons find a lot of beauty in that practice.
And I think that's what made me think of Geertz. That, especially like, have you ever paid to St. Jude? Unless you've been in that, then you know what that means. It's not just that you decide not to wear the camisole top one day.
Right.
That literally taking that off, taking off a lot more than just a garment, a piece of material. Right.
Garments also represent like ideas of spiritual or physical protection. So it's the sense that God is watching over you, and and people can interpret that more and less literally, but like the sense that God is with you and God is watching over you, and that's manifest in the garment, is both beautiful and troubling, right? Right. And so people experience this as kind of beautiful or troubling.
Religion is kind of that way,
right? Religion is kind of that way, and so. So it was just a very interesting and complex thing to study, as it turns out that when you imbue, religious ideas into people's underwear, that it just gets into the everyday messy stuff of lives.
Yeah. Fascinating topic. And I think that there's a lot more that you will, no doubt come out with as you continue to go through the surveys. We look forward to reading more about this. Do you have anything published right now that is accessible?
No, we don't. We're working on, we figured that Jessica and I figured that garments is a very sexy topic. And so we're trying to shoot for a higher tier of journal than we would normally go for in the hopes of capturing somebody's imagination of wanting to know about Mormon magic underwear. So
okay. So nothing yet, but we'll look for that on the horizon.
Yes.
And in the meantime, we wish you luck. Thank you for meeting with us today.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting episode there. And as we said last week, that's the second in a sort of small series on intersections of fashion and clothing And we actually have one more of those coming up next week. I'm just double checking.
No, not next week. Not next week.
Week after next.
Interspersing them, yeah.
That's right, yeah. Next week. Not next week, the week after on Muslim dress and the headscarf issue. But next week, what we do have is an interview with Megan Goodwin. And this is the first from a new interviewer named Andrew Henry. And let's find out who he is.
Hello, my name is Andrew Henry. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Religion at Boston University. My research focuses on early Christianity and really the religions of the late antique Mediterranean world in general. So this includes Judaism and the various Greco-Roman traditions. Specifically, I studied the materiality of ancient magic and demonology. So this would include amulets, curse tablets, and so-called magical gems that were used for healing or protection. And what really interests me and what's the focus of my dissertation is the intersection between artifact and performed ritual. So, for example, an amulet inscribed with a phrase from Christian liturgies, such as, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." This particular phrase appears consistently in authoritative contexts, like a late antique liturgical service, but it also appears on late antique amulets and inscribed on door lintels to protect your house from demonic invasion. I'm arguing to what extent that authoritative ritual inspired the production of the amulet, or inspired someone to view that liturgical phrase as ritually powerful. Very early on in my studies as an undergrad, I was interested in the hazy line between private and public religion, what we mean by religion and magic. So this research comes out of a desire to explore where these categories destabilize. As you can imagine, as someone studying objects, I draw a lot of inspiration from archaeological methods, but also from relatively recent theoretical studies on materiality. I see a lot of value in the so-called new materialisms, the theoretical turn that draws greater attention to object agency or animated ontologies. So this includes theorists like Jane Bennett. But more generally, I come to the Religious Studies Project with a greater interest in the public understanding of religion and using social media to reach wider audiences. Podcasts are a new frontier to me because I've been running a religious studies YouTube channel over the past few years, but I'm excited to try my hand at long-form audio discussions instead of short video productions. So I'm excited to be a part of this project and to see where it goes.
Wonderful to hear from Andrew there, and you should absolutely check out his Religion for Breakfast YouTube channel if you haven't already. He does a lot of interesting work there in quite short videos, engaging with a very broad range of scholarship and presenting it in an alternative format. So that's
Interestingly, that's what the interview is about, challenges and responsibilities for the public scholar of religion, which I suppose we are in a small way as well, which yeah. I've never systematically thought about it, so it's going to be a very interesting episode.
Yeah, it is, and it offers reflections for people at all stages in their academic careers, and it's an excellent interview. So come back next week for that. Yeah, we're in the fallow period for news. Just everything's trundling along. We're happy. Yeah. Are you happy, listeners?
I can't hear you. Can you say it louder? That's enough of that pantomime nonsense. Yeah, we've just kind of set up the schedule now until the summer break coming up, which I think that's the first time we've actually thought about that in any concrete way. It's funny to see the year rushing past at this point, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, this has been fun, David.
Indeed. We should stop wasting people's time. Thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The RSP is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SCO 47750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and our managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bogg. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.